Hello and welcome back to Cooking the Books with me, Gilly Smith, the podcast which takes us through 4 food moments from the books of our favourite A-lister food writers. It's all about life, culture and politics, all through the prism of food. And you can also find me on Food FM, the online radio station and global podcast platform which aims to change the world through food. This week I'm with 2013 MasterChef finalist Saira Hamilton, whose latest book takes us deep into the little-known food culture of Bangladesh. My Bangladesh kitchen is full of food stories and poets and mystics and nostalgia for the country of Saira's ancestors. But as we find out, Bangladesh is also one of the fastest growing economies in the world.
Yes, the economy is growing quickly, but that has unintended consequences, you know, that sort of rapid creation of a middle class which are living in towns and cities now, because the sort of, you know, idyllic rural image that I have of our village home, you know, there are veggies kind of everywhere. And you're right, you know, that is definitely being lost.
But before we're transported to its lush landscapes, we have to step back into the studios of MasterChef 2013. I asked Saira if it changed her life.
Yeah, completely. And it's sort of a dream thing for me, you know, having been a fan of the show and just watched it, grown up watching it and enjoying it. And, you know, that I was one of those people sort of texting all my friends, you know, whilst it was on, talking about, you know, how terrible something was or how brilliant something was. And to actually be there was very surreal, like being in a dream. But I just decided I'm just going to have fun, going to enjoy myself here. And I did.
And you came from a 20-year career. I've heard that you were in law enforcement. Does that mean you were a policewoman?
I worked for actually what's now the National Crime Agency. So I was working in, sounds much more glamorous than it is, in criminal intelligence. So not actually on the ground breaking down doors, but sort of, you know, working behind the scenes.
Amazing, but you're still doing that?
Well, I've slightly moved on, so I'm still in the civil service, kind of working in a government job, but in a different role nowadays. Yes, I kind of had a bit of time off, whilst I, you know, fully engrossed myself in the whole cooking world and food world, which I loved, and then after a bit, you know, it felt like back to reality a little bit.
It's amazing, isn't it? The amount of people who have really straight jobs. I mean, your job sounds a little bit more glamorous than the bank managers and accountants I talk to. But, you know, there are so many of these people for whom cooking is like a superpower. You know, they waft it out having spent 20 years in banking or whatever. And suddenly they're doing supper clubs and they're appearing on This Morning. And it really is quite extraordinary what cooking can do. Why do you think it has that power to propel you into such a different world?
I mean, I genuinely think that for me, it's my creative outlet. You know, you have the job and you have the day job, and, you know, I had children, and, you know, you're doing all of that stuff, and you know, that was my creative time, you know, the time to think about it. It's my, you know, sort of getting away from the world, you know, dreaming up recipes, thinking I was that sort of person. We would go to lots of restaurants, and, you know, we love eating, you know, food from all over the world. And as I'm sitting there eating, I'm thinking, oh, this is really good. Oh, I love the way that sort of, you know, sour note comes in and, you know, cleanses your palate and all that. And then I would go home and try and recreate it. So, you know, so for me, it's always been kind of there in the background. But I think for all the other people you're saying, like you say, they've got these kind of careers that are completely straight jobs. I quite like that, really straight jobs, and then they come into this cooking thing. I think shows like MasterChef are just brilliant for that. You know, they really are, because they unleash this potential in you. And the brilliant thing about the show, I know, you know, people have their views about it, and I know it's not everybody's cup of tea, but the wonderful thing about the show is that you learn so much. You know, the cook I was at the beginning of my journey, my MasterChef journey, to use that phrase, it was very different to the cook that came out at the end. You know, you learn so much if you just keep your eyes open, you know, absorb stuff, listen to what people tell you, watch other people. The access you get on MasterChef to some of the most amazing chefs and kind of creative minds in the industry is brilliant. You'll never get that anywhere else. You've just got to just go for it.
Yeah, and likewise, you know, we get a huge amount out of it. You know, there's so much effort to get representation of diverse ethnic communities on telly as presenters, but actually it's the TV chefs, it's Bake Off and MasterChef where you get that representation. So we learn a lot about different community cooking and cooking from all over the world. I mean, you were known in MasterChef days as a Bengali chef. Yet this book that we're going to be talking about today is My Bangladesh Kitchen, and you do write a lot about the history and the culture of your country. I mean, do you call yourself Bangladeshi or Bengali?
That's really difficult. I think I interchange it genuinely. I don't think it's kind of. I have many labels. I'm a British Asian. I'm Bengali. I'm Bangladeshi. So I'm all of those things. So the main difference for me is, Bengal is a region. Bengal spans India and Bangladesh, and when it comes to the food, the language, the culture, the music, it's all Bengali. Everyone has a kind of a right to that, if you like. From the whole of Bengal, but Bangladesh is a different, kind of part of it, and obviously as a relatively new country, we just celebrated the 50th anniversary of independence last year. Where am I? And but that, because it's such a I say relatively new country, still many people who were there at the birth of the nation, being Bangladeshi is also something that instills great pride. So I think it's fine to say either, really, you're both.
Yeah, it's part of a modern movement, isn't it? I mean, Bengal has been around since the 3rd century BC. It has a rich heritage of Buddhist and Hindu dynasties and Arab settlers. Bangladesh is now the 8th most populous country in the world. And it has the biggest refugee populations, largely because of the Rohingya exodus a few years back. From Myanmar, which it borders. It's really interesting to look at the geography here. There's India to the west, north and east, Myanmar to the south east, and the Bay of Bengal to the south. And it's a very rural country, isn't it? Mostly, although Dhaka is absolutely thriving, and it's one of the fastest growing economies, isn't it?
It definitely is in that category, which is brilliant to see. I mean, they, as a country, as you say, kind of where they are situated, and the geography, tells a lot about the kind of the people and how they live and everything else. And I think people, if anyone's been lucky enough to go to Bangladesh, brilliant. If you haven't, book your ticket immediately, because it's wonderful. There's so much to see. It's much more, and I think for maybe for British or European tourists or travellers, they often think of India. They'll have an image in their mind of India and what that's like, and then they probably don't have any image of what Bangladesh is like. But if you've ever been to Thailand or Burma or Cambodia, it's much more like that. When you get into the countryside, it's very lush, it's very verdant. There's sort of jungle, there's water everywhere, rivers, crisscrossing the country. But it is, it's a wonderful. It is a wonderful country. People are very proud of their nation, as I say, as a relatively young nation, and they're doing good things. They're doing good things there, I would say.
Well, and so it seems, but I'm just thinking about what I know when I was doing this, sort of reading your book and doing the prep for this, and I was thinking, what do I know about Bangladesh? I know that it's very vulnerable to climate change. It's a very low-lying country. I know that a lot of the Indian restaurants that, grew up in Britain in the 1970s and 80s it was mostly Bangladeshi chefs in the kitchen.
Yeah.
And it felt to me that there's a lot of hiding behind India. It's that there's not. I mean, it's interesting that you use that word pride, and maybe that is a resurgence of interest and pride in the country. But it certainly hasn't been that representation of Bangladeshi people. Certainly in Britain, hasn't been something that has been terribly embraced by the Bangladeshis, or so it seems. I mean, is that just me?
I don't know that. I don't know what the motivations are, other than I think. Maybe, the rest of Britain wasn't ready for that, if it's been before. I grew up, in the, I'm a child of the 70s, grew up in the 80s in a very monocultural sort of place. Really, there weren't many Asian people where I lived at all.
Where did you live?
So I lived in Essex. I describe myself as a Bengali Welsh Essex girl. I was born in Wales, but brought up in Essex. And, in Harlow New Town, which is, if you've ever been there, it's what you'd expect it to be. I loved it. I had a brilliant childhood growing up there. But there weren't many other Asian people around in those days. And if I had said to somebody, I'm from, when people were calling me things and, talking about it, they knew about India, they know what an Indian is, but they wouldn't have a clue what a Bangladeshi person was. So you just didn't bother saying it. You wouldn't say,
Yeah.
oh, well,
Maybe
actually, my parents are from Bangladesh, because they would say, what? What does that mean? So and I think that translated to the food as well. You wouldn't bother trying to educate, somebody and say, well, actually, this is Bangladeshi food. It's not. You would just say it's Indian and have done with it.
Right, that is it, probably. You've probably hit the nail on the head. It's in the attempt to assimilate, just keep your head down, don't answer too many questions.
Absolutely.
If nobody's asking, just get on with it. The fact that we absolutely love Indian food laid out a canvas for us to paint rather prettier pictures on.
Exactly.
Now, of course, we can't get enough of the fabulous stories behind it. And that's what your book is so full of. Before we go into your first food moment, let's just paint a picture. It's a rather romantic ideal that you paint of women squatting on a little platform, like your mother Nadira, who you say you were so inspired by, and you talked about a lot in MasterChef. You talk about them stirring and cooking and gossiping and laughing, and you say that your mother loves her kitchen here that's full of gadgets, but there is that sort of romantic notion of going back to the way things were. Would your mother feel as romantic about that idea of chopping and pasting and spending hours making paste? Which does she prefer, her gadgets or her pestle and mortar?
Well, my mother's no longer with us now, but I think if she was here, she would definitely have said a bit of both. She definitely wouldn't want to do that every day. She wouldn't want to be, squatting down and kind of, grinding the spices by hand and all that kind of thing. But the thing it is romantic. The word you use, romantic, is exactly right. And it is a romantic image. But it's also, I think the thing that's really lovely is you could do that with a smoky wood fire and kind of your own homemade spice paste, when there's a communal effort, when there's a gang of women, and somebody's chopping the onions and the other person's preparing the fish and somebody's grinding the turmeric paste for you. You've got all that going. If it's just you, with our lives that we live here, and you're at work and then you come home, you're not going to want to do that. You're going to want to throw it in the blender and kind of, get it in the pan and get the food on the table. That's kind of, but it's a different thing. And I think there's something, the romanticism of it comes from how close you are to the origins of that food. You are, the fish is from the pond beside you and the spices are from not very far. And I think we're all yearning for that now. I mean, that's definitely a movement in whatever cuisine you're talking about, to feel close to your ingredients. And I'm a great believer in sort of feeling your food. The worst thing about writing the book for me was having to measure everything. That is not the way I cook in my life, normally. So, but that kind of taste, feel and looking, that becomes much more the norm when you're cooking in that way, I think.
Yeah, no, absolutely. That is exactly it. That sounds like my New Year in Cornwall, actually. A big kitchen filled with women.
Yeah.
Us all doing bits and bobs of, putting a thing together and spending all day, going out and getting the fish from the day boat and coming back and using local produce and loving it. So you're absolutely right. Yeah. But, and it is that idea that time is precious.
Yeah.
We seem to have lost it. Everybody has 24 hours in the day, and I'm constantly fighting this time porn narrative, but that image that you portray is kind of what we all yearn for. There's an ache in our soul. Was there an ache in your soul as you became an adult and you were sort of thinking about where you came from? It's a story I hear a lot when teenagers, particularly growing up from a different culture in Britain, or, don't take the lunchbox to school because it might be a bit smelly and desperately want to assimilate. But actually, when you get to your early 20s, you suddenly kind of get a yearning for who you are. And you find it in your food. Did that happen to you?
It kind of did. I recognise that, entirely, that image that you're describing there. There's that great film, Bargee on the Beach, isn't there? Which is exactly that sort of, when everyone else would get out their kind of sandwiches on the bus, I would have, paratha and aloo bhaji, which is kind of, a very different thing. I didn't at the time, and I think again because of the sort of monocultural kind of environment in which I grew up in. So I never really felt everyone was very interested. The people, there was a lot of interest and a kind of novel. It was novel, the sorts of smells that were coming out of our kitchen and the kind of things that were going on there. So people were interested. So maybe I was just lucky. I think I was also very lucky that my parents always kept a very close relationship with the country of their birth, and we went nearly every year. We visited, so it never felt like this. As a second generation immigrant, I realised how lucky I was to get that experience, because a lot of people don't. But did I? Yeah, yes, I did. I missed as soon as I left, and I left home at 18, and as soon as I left, I missed my mum's cooking, terribly. But luckily, I was the one who was always in the kitchen with her, so I felt I was able to recreate it. And it was never as good as hers, certainly not in the beginning. It wasn't the same thing. But my sister had not done that. So my older sister, obviously, we grew up exactly in the same house, in the same way. But Molly was never interested in the cooking. So when she left, she really did miss it, because she couldn't recreate it. Even a pastiche of it, she couldn't do it, but I could. The yearning then just became for me to really learn and perfect and really get all of the knowledge out of my mum's head. And again, it's a very oral culture, so she would never have written anything down in terms of a recipe, but to get it all out of her head. So then every time I saw her, every weekend we visited, I was still with her in the kitchen, but this time I was properly on listening mode so that I could learn.
Yeah. And it is very much about technique, isn't it? And let's go into your first food moment to give some colour and taste and smell to that. You've chosen the shabsi pakora, the vegetable pakoras, little golden balls of delicious vegetables, lightly coated in a crispy, crunchy batter. Oh my God, it's only 10 o'clock in the morning, but I can taste this right now. Tell us why you chose that, and tell us about the technique. What did you learn from your mother?
Well, I think the main thing I learned, and then again, this might come up again and again, but the sort of difference between what you get in an Indian restaurant, I'm doing the quotation thing there, and what you get in at home, is that the restaurant version is a sort of what I have found to be a very heavy, doughy, battery kind of thing with a couple of vegetables, a hint of vegetable in there. Whereas in the Bengali way of doing it is completely different. You start with the vegetables. The vegetables are abundant. So what you do is everything gets shredded up and put there. And then you just add a bit of flour, a bit of water, a bit of flour, a bit of water. And only when the vegetables are just bound, just kind of starting to hold together, you fry them. And then what you get is this almost sort of crispy tempura-like batter, which is just coating the vegetables. And as you bite into them, you get the sweetness. So the sorts of vegetables you would use have a lot of natural sweetness in them anyway. So onions, carrots, potato, these are all sugary, starchy kind of vegetables. And so as you cook them, quickly in hot oil, you just get that amazing, the spice is very delicate. It's not overly spiced. There's only really turmeric and chili in there and a bit of salt. So what you're getting is the kind of perfection of those vegetables just cooked, sweetness from them with the spice of the batter. That's all you need. I'm a great believer in that. Don't overcomplicate things. That in itself, if you haven't tried it, you must. They're just brilliant.
Yeah. And I mean, you talk a lot about the Bangladesh kitchen using locally sourced products. I mean, everything grows or swims in the many, many rivers crossing the whole country. What's so specifically Bangladeshi about those pakora?
I think that also the use of rice flour, it's one of those things that I use. So actually, it's kind of naturally quite a gluten-free sort of diet. We don't use a lot of wheat flour. It's not a bread-based culture. It's a rice-based kind of food culture over there. So that and what the rice flour does is it makes it incredibly crispy and keeps it light in that way. And then the other thing I would say that makes it particularly Bangladeshi is I'm not an expert on other Indian cuisine, so hopefully I won't say anything that's out of line here, but we use a lot of like fresh chilies and fresh coriander, so you get that almost garden freshness from the things that you're eating, and you can't substitute a green chili. There's green chilies in so many in so many Bengali dishes, because that doesn't just give you heat, it gives you flavour and that kind of real freshness. So I think if I had to pick one thing, I'd say that's what makes them different, and Bengali is that kind of very fresh and the fresh herbs and chilies that make it.
Yeah. And you do say that Bangladesh has always been a country where people have traditionally grown things in their back garden,
yep.
like we used to, and everyone used to all over the world. I did a programme for my other podcast, Right to Food, for the Food Foundation, with one of the global youth leaders for Act for Food, Act for Change. And she's a young woman, and she is campaigning for young people in Bangladesh to really kind of become more aware of nutrition, that malnutrition is a really big deal. And she says that there's a real loss of that culture. People are no longer growing their food, and it feels like this kind of awful loss of connection that we've had in this country, which is so linked to climate change, could be happening in Bangladesh. How much of those stories are you hearing?
I think that is so true. And actually what you were saying before, yes, the economy is growing quickly, but that has unintended consequences, that sort of rapid creation of a middle class, which are living in towns and cities now. Because the sort of, idyllic rural image that I have of our village home, and everybody's home has got, even if it's a tiny little patch of, and everything grows very easily there. So, there are veggies kind of everywhere. And you're right, that is definitely being lost by people. And I think then, as soon as you get one step removed, it's very easy to get two or three, and then kind of processed foods, which was never a thing. It just wasn't a thing that you could get in Bangladesh.
You talk about the fish
20 years ago. Yeah, exactly, the fish farms. Although to be fair, most locals don't eat that fish. That is very much for export. The sorts of fish Bangladeshi people eat are usually inedible for anyone else because they've got so many bones in them. But yeah, so I think that is a real shame. But having said that, I still feel, and I can't speak for everybody, obviously, but I still feel like the vegetable quotient, shall we say, in most Bangladeshi people's diet, vegetables and fish and lentils and rice, that is still, I would say, the basis of most Bangladeshi people's diets, even now, even in the towns and cities.
Yeah, and your second food moment is taka dal.
Yes.
Lentils tempered with garlic, one of my absolute favourite dishes, and staple across the whole of the Indian subcontinent. Again, what is different about this one? What's Bangladeshi about it?
So there's a couple of varieties of dal in the book. I mean, the taka dal is the classic. It's the lentils with kind of not much in it. In terms of you just cook them kind of plain. But and then you temper it, which is when you kind of fry in hot oil, some spices, onions, garlic, till they're properly golden and crispy, almost burnt. Where you're slightly getting that slight bitterness from the garlic. All gets chucked into the dal at the end. I mean, what's Bengali about it? It's just literally, for a Bengali person, if you put a meal on the table and there's no dal, you haven't eaten. You could eat the whole thing. And then you would still want some dal at the end. It's a bit like, and I used to say to my cooking classes, it's a bit like serving a roast dinner with no gravy. You just can't do it. It's not outrageous. It's exactly, it wouldn't happen. And a Bangladeshi person would never do it. I mean, the one that and the other thing is the varieties of it. So one of the other things that we really like in Bangladeshi food is sourness. We like a bit of tok, as we call it, a bit of tok in the food, and it really works with the heat and the kind of sweetness of the lentils as well, which are generally quite sweet. So so over there it might be sour mango, unripe mango that goes in there, or other kind of green vegetables. Tamarind goes in there, but over here, the thing that I really remember is when my mum came over here, you couldn't really get, sour mangoes, or you could get anything really in the shops in those days. But we did have rhubarb in the garden. We had rhubarb, we had gooseberry bushes. So she would bring those, the same flavours, but totally different. We don't get gooseberries in Bangladesh. You just definitely don't get rhubarb. But you chop up a stick of rhubarb and stick it in your dal before you temper it. Honestly, it's incredible.
Fascinating.
You'll be amazed.
I'll give it a go.
Yeah,
Fantastic.
It's wonderful. Yeah.
Your third food moment is about the fish of Bangladesh, and you've chosen the chingri matcha buna. Is that how
Well
you
done.
pronounce it?
I like it. Very well. Good.
King prawns with tomato and chili.
Exactly. Chingri mutton buna. Yes, exactly.
It's one of the dishes on the front cover of the book.
Yeah.
Tell us about fish and seafood. This is one of the things that actually does describe a Bangladeshi diet, doesn't
Yes,
it? It's
yeah.
one of the main proponents.
I think, it's definitely one of the, if I had to kind of, describe what's different between Bangladeshi food and Indian food, the prevalence of fish is definitely in there. And it tends to be river fish as well. So that's the other thing. So yes, there is, as you said, on the south, the Bay of Bengal, there's a big sea coast, and prawns and sea fish, definitely are abundance, but generally in the south of the country. But in the rest of the country, it's all about the rivers, and there are very big rivers and with very big fish in them. So it's almost like they tend to be cut, as like a meaty steak fish for the big ones. But everything from the tiniest little, like just the tip of your little finger, kind of little silver fish, which will be kind of like scooped up in a very fine net, and then just really simply fried with some salt and turmeric and green chilies. Having that with white rice is amazing. So there's just fish and everything. I mean, I chose the king prawns because Bangladesh is definitely known for its prawns now. We don't know the figures, but we export prawns all over the world. And but this recipe is for like the really big, the treat prawns, as I would call them. The great big ones where you can find, and they're very kind of meaty and luxuriant and amazing. And my mum would always cook them. This was our kind of when we could call in favours for mum. So once we'd left home, we were coming to visit, we'd say, "Oh, mum, could we have that when we come to visit?" And she would always get the biggest, almost like as big as a lobster, kind of like massive great prawns from the Bengali shop which had opened down the road, and get that and the whole prawn, obviously. And one of my favourite memories was watching my poor husband when he came for the first few times over to our house, and we're all very loud, and kind of he wasn't really used to that sort of thing. And watching my mother, who was tiny, I'm short. My mother was very petite, she was like, you could put her in your pocket, and very petite, very.
I love the way you're
proper.
holding your fingers up there, as if you could actually fit her between your thumb and your forefinger.
But she was very tiny, petite, very glamorous, very put together. Always looked amazing. But her tackling a massive prawn head and like crunching away at it and sucking out the brains, and my husband's face was just he's from Guildford. He'd never seen anything like this. It was terrifying. It was great. Very funny.
Presumably, you can make this dish with the less huge but monster prawns that you described.
Yes, you can make it with any prawn. It's probably the one I get the most sort of contact and emails about, of people saying, "Oh, I tried that and it was fantastic." And it's a good starter one, I think.
Yeah. Your final food moment is the beef and potato curry. I'm not even going to pretend that I can get my lips around this one. Goru mangsho daye alu, is it?
It's very difficult for me to write these things in English. So goru mangsho diye alu. So that just means goru is cow. So cow meat with potatoes. It's very simple. It's a very simple dish title, but it sounds better, doesn't it?
Yeah, it does. It's a very traditional curry. Again, I'm looking through it, and I'm not seeing a difference between what I would do as a typical sort of Indian curry. I mean, what makes it Bangladeshi? I
mean, there's a couple of techniques. So let's say, I'm not saying that these are exclusive, to Bangladesh, but I mean, the main things, particularly when you do a buna, which is the kind of the technique of cooking as well. The couple of things that I would. One, lots of onions and plenty of oil. And the reason that you need the oil is because you need to cook those spices well before they burn. If you haven't got enough oil in the pan, that's what's going to happen. The spices will burn and the flavour will be impaired. It won't be terrible. It won't be kind of, the worst thing in the world, but it won't be the best it can be. And then there's another thing which happens, which is the koshano, which I have no idea what the English equivalent of that is, but what it is when you're cooking your spice paste, and I'm sure that your listeners will be well aware of this, but you see that oil rise to the surface. So that koshano is when the spices are cooked, and that's when you can sort of turn the heat down, add some water, and then get things kind of cooking long and slow so that the meat really breaks down. But you know, and if you do it before that, you're just never going to get the same depth of flavour into it. And then the other thing I would say is I use quite a lot of whole spices, which irritates some people because they're like, oh, why is this twig in my food? And the answer is because it makes your food taste nice. And it really does. It adds to those different levels. If you just use ground spices, you're only ever going to get one dimension of flavour. If you then add to that with whole spices, you get those kind of high floral aromatic notes. And then you add lots of aromats, you know, loads of ginger and garlic. When you think you've got enough garlic, add in another 3 cloves of garlic, you know, and just kind of, you know, really ramp it up, be very bold and generous with your kind of, you know, spicing. Because, you know, especially when you're cooking meat, it can take it, you know, you can take it.
Yeah, and time as well.
Yeah.
I remember my parents always used to, I grew up in Malaysia, and they loved to cook Malay curries, and they would cook them for 12 hours at a time, again with loads of twigs and things in,
exactly.
constantly pulling things out. But it really did make a huge difference.
Yeah.
I mean, can you make these curries, I was going to say quickly, but, you know, less than 12 hours? I
mean, you can, you know, and I have to say some of the recipes, you know, again, maybe because of the way I was brought up, you know, my parents both worked, you know, my mum was a doctor. She would come in until, you know, surgery wouldn't finish till 7:30 sometimes. And then she would have to cook for us, you know, so you have to adapt. You can't always cook things for 12 hours. It's nice if you can, but, you know, but if you can't, there are other ways to do it. You know, you use different sort of meat. You would use kind of meat on the bone and that sort of thing. You might use something much quicker. Or you cook fish, you know, which you can do really quickly, or just have vegetables. That's all fine. But yeah, you can do it. But yeah, I mean, for me,
it's always going to taste nicer with the time.
It is. The time, I think, can actually go into making the curry base as well. So if you really were short on time, you could spend lots of time on that, get something really, really packed of flavour, stick that in the fridge then, and then when you do come home on a Wednesday, you know, you've done all the hard work in advance, and you can actually just get some quick chicken fillets or something and stick them in. Never going to be as good, like I said, but you know, but it's certainly very tasty.
Yeah. Are you still doing the supper clubs?
Not so much anymore, I must say. It's been a bit, you know, since the pandemic and everything, you know, there was always a plan that I would still do those. So now I'm sort of limited to, I do a few kind of charity gigs and that kind of thing where what I really like to do now is the sort of the lessons or the demonstrations. So I can sort of, you know, really get across to people sort of, you know, the differences and how they can recreate these things at home. But the actual supper clubs are a bit too, I love going to them, but yeah, maybe not for me anymore.
Thanks for listening. Please get in touch on social media. I'm on at Cooking the Books with Gilly Smith on Instagram and at Gilly Smith on Twitter, and sign up for my newsletter at gillysmith.com to find out about the Cooking the Books supper club at my house. I'm hoping that Saira will be able to do one for us in the second half of this year. And I'll be back next year with the biblical cuisine of Ruth Nyman's Frike, wild wheats and ancient grains.